I have one last question for now, at least. When we think about countries, we tend to think at the macro level, but fragility seems much easier to notice at the micro level, at the person, human level. What do you think about the links between macroeconomic policy and fragility? And sort of what's your take on how macro policy interacts with fragility?
Some of it is what we were talking about earlier in terms of aid allocation and so on. But yeah, I've been thinking a little bit more about that in the context of IMF programs in fragile states and so on, because many of these countries have their backs up against the wall in terms of macroeconomic balances. And we know that certainly the Yemen civil war started the day after they cut fuel subsidies as a part of an IMF program. Now, correlation is not causation, so there are not a lot of other things going on in Yemen. Let's be careful about that. But there's certainly something about the role of macroeconomic austerity or fiscal austerity and its fragility consequences. Now, where I'm thinking about this is on the other side, which is in post-conflict situations. The IMF, comes out with these reports, and now the IMF has a new deputy director for fragility, conflict, and violence, who's a good friend of mine. But when I look at their macro analysis of post-conflict situations, they are looking favorably upon those countries that have been able to increase taxes and reduce fiscal deficits. Because in general, that's a good thing. And these countries, right? But you'd really ask yourself the question, how do you increase taxes and reduce fiscal deficit? It's basically fiscal austerity. Now, if you're in a country where these people have been devastated from a civil war, and they're very poor, and the economy isn't growing, and everything's at a standstill, is this the highest priority? Is to reduce the fiscal deficit? Maybe you should sustain a high fiscal deficit for a few years. Again, this comes back to the venture capital idea, right? You give aid to the country and let them get off the ground, because they may still be in a fragility trap. Just because the peace agreement has been signed doesn't mean they're out of the woods.
Yeah, they can actually go right back into conflict.
They can go right back as they have done. So we have to really rethink macroeconomic policy. The sort of standard precepts of macroeconomic policy in the context of post-conflict, or in the context of fragility. I think that does require some rethinking.
So Shanta, I'm very much aware that we're approaching the end of our conversation. I wanted to ask you a quick question before we wrap it up. What are the 1-2 things about working on fragile states and conflict, or on fragility in general, that you wish you would have known starting in this field, when you moved from the theoretical economics to the practical aspects of policy? What is the one thing that you would tell your younger self?
Two of those things I've already alluded to. I mean, the concept of a fragility trap and the idea of venture capital for fragile states was not only something I didn't know, but in fact, all of my work up to that point was pointed in the opposite direction, because I was doing all this work on aid effectiveness and governance and the importance of governance for aid effectiveness. But I think with fragile states, that actually was an excessive emphasis. Even though we realize that the governance is the most important thing, this is how do you get that governance to improve, might actually involve different things. And the second is maybe rethinking the whole macroeconomic framework for fragile states. And that has quite a few implications. Actually, I mean, this again is something we had a dialogue about. I mean, Iraq was another example, right? So, during the peak 2014, and the peak of ISIS and oil prices crashing down, Iraq was really in trouble. Deep, deep trouble. Plus, of course, all the wars going on around the country. So we decided, correctly in my view, that Iraq should get some budget support to be able to keep the place functioning, because otherwise it could really collapse. And of course, if Iraq collapses, the whole Middle East collapses with it. But in our typical fashion, we said, well, if there's budget support, there has to be some policy reforms. So we should now, have them do some, civil service reform or electricity pricing tariff reform and things like that, because otherwise it's a quote weak program. We can't just give them a blank check. And I had to step in and actually say, no, this is a time when we do have to give them a blank check. I coined the phrase that there are two kinds of development policy operations. There's budget support and life support. This is life support. And for those, you don't expect them to do some major institutional reform that they haven't been able to do for the last 25, 30 years. Suddenly on this aspect. So we have to really rethink this whole approach to macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic aid, or aid to support macroeconomic policies, very differently in some of these extreme cases.